The Mourner by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. A gorgeous scene of kingly pride is the prospect now before us. The offspring of art, the nursling of nature, where can the eye rest on a landscape more deliciously lovely than the fair expanse of Virginia water, now an open mirror to the sky, now shaded by umbrageous banks, which wind into dark recesses, or are rounded into soft promontories. Looking down on it now that the sun is low in the west, the eye is dazzled, the soul oppressed by excessive beauty. Earth, water, air drink to overflowing the radiance that streams from yonder well of light. The foliage of the trees seems dripping with the golden flood, while the lake, filled with no earthly dew, appears but an embasoning of the sun-tinctured atmosphere, and trees and gay pavilion float in its depth, more dear, more distinct than their twins in the upper air. Nor is the scene silent. Strains more sweet than those that lull Venus to her balmy rest, more inspiring than the song of Tiresias which awoke Alexander to the deed of ruin, more solemn than the chantings of St. Cecilia, float along the waves and mingle with the lagging breeze, which ruffles not the lake. Strange, that a few dark scores should be the key to this fountain of sound, the unconscious link between unregarded noise and harmonies which unclose paradise to our entranced senses. The sun touches the extreme boundary, and a softer, milder light mingles a roseate tinge with the fiery glow. Our boat has floated long on the broad expanse, now let it approach the umbrageous bank. The green tresses of the graceful willow dip into the waters, which are checked by them into a ripple. The startled teal dart from their recess, skimming the waves with splashing wing. The stately swans float onward, while innumerable waterfowl cluster together out of the way of the oars. The twilight is blotted by no dark shades, it is one subdued, equal receding of the great tide of day. We may disembark, and wander yet amid the glades, long before the thickening shadows speak of night. The plantations are formed of every English tree, with an old oak or two standing out in the walks. There the glancing foliage obscures heaven, as the silken texture of a veil a woman's lovely features. Beneath such fretwork we may indulge in light-hearted thoughts, or if sadder meditations lead us to seek darker shades, we may pass the cascade towards the large groves of pine, with their vast undergrowth of laurel reaching up to the belvedere. Or, on the opposite side of the water, sit under the shadow of the silver-stemmed birch, or beneath the leafy pavilions of those fine old beeches, whose high fantastic roots seem formed in nature's sport, and the near jungle of sweet-smelling myrica leaves no sense unvisited by pleasant ministration. Now this splendid scene is reserved for the royal possessor, but in past years, while the lodge was called the Regent's Cottage, or before, when the underranger inhabited it, the mazy paths of Chapel Wood were open, and the iron gates enclosing the plantations and Virginia water were guarded by no Cerberus untamable by sops. It was here, on a summer's evening, that Horace Neville and his two fair cousins floated idly on the placid lake. Neville had been eloquent in praise of English scenery. In distant climes, he said, we may find landscapes grand in barbaric wildness, or rich in the luxuriant vegetation of the south, or sublime in alpine magnificence. We may lament, though it is ungrateful to say so on such a night as this, the want of a more genial sky, but where fine scenery to be compared to the verdant, well-wooded, well-watered groves of our native land, the clustering cottages shadowed by fine old elms, each garden blooming with early flowers, each lattice gay with geraniums and roses, the blue-eyed child devouring his white bread while he drives a cow to graze, the hedge redolent with summer blooms, the enclosed cornfields, seas of golden grain weltering in the breeze, the stile, the track across the meadow, leading through the copse under which the path winds, and the meeting branches overhead, which give by their dimming tracery a cathedral-like solemnity to the scene, the river winding with sweet inland murmur. And as additional graces, spots like these, oases of taste, gardens of Eden, the works of wealth, which evince at once the greatest power and the greatest will to create beauty. And yet, continued Neville, it was with difficulty that I persuaded myself to reap the best fruits of my uncle's will, and to inhabit this spot, familiar to my boyhood, associated with unavailing regrets and recollected pain. Horace Neville was a man of birth, of wealth, but he could hardly be termed a man of the world. There was in his nature a gentleness, a sweetness, a winning sensibility, allied to talent and personal distinction, that gave weight to his simplest expressions, and excited sympathy for all his emotions. His younger cousin, his junior by several years, was attached to him by the tenderest sentiments, secret long, but they were now betrothed to each other, a lovely, happy pair. She looked inquiringly, but he turned away. No more of this, he said, and giving a swifter impulse to their boat, they speedily reached the shore, landed, and walked through the long extent of Chapel Wood. It was dark night before they met their carriage at Bishopsgate. A week or two after, Horace received letters to call him to a distant part of the country. A few days before his departure, he requested his cousin to walk with him. They bent their steps across several meadows to Old Windsor churchyard. At first he did not deviate from the usual path, and as they went they talked cheerfully, gaily. The beauteous sunny day might well exhilarate them. The dancing waves sped onwards at their feet. The country church lifted its rustic spire into the bright pure sky. There was nothing in their conversation that could induce his cousin to think that Neville had led her hither for any saddening purpose. But when they were about to quit the churchyard, Horace, as if he had suddenly recollected himself, turned from the path, crossed the greensward, and paused beside a grave near the river. No stone was there to commemorate the being who reposed beneath. It was thickly grown with grass, starred by a luxuriant growth of humble daisies. A few dead leaves, a broken bramble twig, defaced its neatness. Neville removed these and then said, "Juliet, I commit this sacred spot to your keeping while I am away." "There is no monument," he continued, for her commands were implicitly obeyed by the two beings to whom she addressed them. "One day another may lie near, and his name will be her epitaph. I do not mean myself," he said, half smiling at the terror his cousin's countenance expressed, "but promise me, Juliet, to preserve this grave from every violation. I do not wish to sadden you by the story, yet if I have excited your interest I will satisfy it, but not now, not here." It was not till the following day, when, in company with her sister, they again visited Virginia Water, that, seated under the shadow of its pines, whose melodious swinging in the wind breathed unearthly harmony, Neville, unasked, commenced his story. "I was sent to Eton at 11 years of age. I will not dwell upon my sufferings there. I would hardly refer to them, did they not make a part of my present narration. I was a fag to a hard taskmaster. Every labour he could invent, and the youthful tyrant was ingenious, he devised for my annoyance. Early and late I was forced to be in attendance to the neglect of my school duties, so incurring punishment. There were worse things to bear than these. It was his delight to put me to shame, and finding that I had too much of my mother in my blood, to endeavour to compel me to acts of cruelty from which my nature revolted. I refused to obey. Speak of West Indian slavery. I hope things may be better now. In my days, the tender years of aristocratic childhood were yielded up to a capricious, unrelenting, cruel bondage, far beyond the measured despotism of Jamaica. One day I had been 2 years at school and was nearly 13. My tyrant, I will give him no other name, issued a command in the wantonness of power, for me to destroy a poor little bullfinch I had tamed and caged. In a hapless hour he found it in my room, and was indignant that I should dare to appropriate a single pleasure. I refused, stubbornly, dauntlessly, though the consequence of my disobedience was immediate and terrible. At this moment a message came from my tormentor's tutor. His father had arrived. "Well, old lad," he cried, "I shall pay you off some day." Seizing my pet at the same time, he wrung its neck, threw it at my feet, and with a laugh of derision, quitted the room. Never before, never may I again feel the same swelling, boiling fury in my bursting heart. The sight of my nursling expiring at my feet, my desire of vengeance, my impotence created a Vesuvius within me that no tears flowed to quench. Could I have acted, my passion, it would have been less torturous. It was so when I burst into a torrent of abuse and imprecation. My vocabulary, it must have been a choice collection, was supplied by him against whom it was levelled, but words were air. I desired to give more substantial proof of my resentment. I destroyed everything in the room belonging to him. I tore them to pieces, I stamped on them, crushed them with more than childish strength. My last act was to seize a timepiece, on which my tyrant infinitely prided himself, and to dash it to the ground. The sight of this, as it lay shattered at my feet, recalled me to my senses, and something like an emotion of fear allayed the tumult in my heart. I began to meditate an escape. I got out of the house, ran down a lane and across some meadows far out of bounds above Eton. I was seen by an elder boy, a friend of my tormentor. He called to me, thinking at first that I was performing some errand for him, but seeing that I shirked, he repeated his "come up" in an authoritative voice. It put wings to my heels. He did not deem it necessary to pursue. "But I grow tedious, my dear Juliet. Enough that fears the most intense, of punishment both from my masters and the upper boys, made me resolve to run away. I reached the banks of the Thames, tied my clothes over my head, swam across, and, traversing several fields, entered Windsor Forest. with a vague, childish feeling of being able to hide myself forever in the unexplored obscurity of its immeasurable wilds. It was early autumn, the weather was mild, even warm, the forest oaks yet showed no sign of winter change, though the fern beneath wore a yellowy tinge. I got within Chapel Wood, I fed upon chestnuts and beechnuts, I continued to hide myself from the gamekeepers and woodmen. I lived thus 2 days. But chestnuts and beechnuts were sorry fare to a growing lad of 13 years old. A day's rain occurred, and I began to think myself the most unfortunate boy on record. I had a distant, obscure idea of starvation. I thought of the children in the wood, of their leafy shroud, gift of the pious robin. This brought my poor bullfinch to my mind, and tears streamed in torrents down my cheeks. I thought of my father and mother, of you then my little baby cousin and playmate, and I cried with renewed fervour, till, quite exhausted, I curled myself up under a huge oak among some dry leaves, the relics of 100 summers, and fell asleep. I ramble on in my narration as if I had a story to tell, yet I have little except a portrait, a sketch to present for your amusement or interest. When I awoke, the first object that met my opening eyes was a little foot, delicately clad in silk and soft kid. I looked up in dismay, expecting to behold some gaily dressed appendage to this indication of high-bred elegance. But I saw a girl, perhaps 17, simply clad in a dark cotton dress, her face shaded by a large, very coarse straw hat. She was pale even to marmoreal whiteness. Her chestnut-coloured hair was parted in plain tresses across a brow which wore traces of extreme suffering. Her eyes were blue, full, large, melancholy, often even suffused with tears. But her mouth had an infantine sweetness and innocence in its expression that softened the otherwise sad expression of her countenance. She spoke to me. I was too hungry, too exhausted, too unhappy to resist her kindness, and gladly permitted her to lead me to her home. We passed out of the wood by some broken palings on to Bishopsgate Heath, and after no long walk arrived at her habitation. It was a solitary, dreary-looking cottage. The palings were in disrepair, the garden waste, the lattices unadorned by flowers or creepers. Within, all was neat but sombre and even mean. The diminutiveness of a cottage requires an appearance of cheerfulness and elegance to make it pleasing. The bare floor, clean it is true, the rush chairs, deal table, checked curtains of this cot, were beneath even a peasant's rusticity. Yet it was the dwelling of my lovely guide, whose little white hand, delicately gloved, contrasted with her unadorned attire, as did her gentle self with the clumsy appurtenances of her too humble dwelling. Poor child, she had meant entirely to hide her origin, to degrade herself to a peasant's state, and little thought that she forever betrayed herself by the strangest incongruities. Thus the arrangements of her table were mean, her fare meagre for a hermit, but the linen was matchlessly fine, and wax lights stood in candlesticks which a beggar would almost have disdained to own. But I talk of circumstances I observed afterwards. Then I was chiefly aware of the plentiful breakfast she caused her single attendant, a young girl, to place before me, and of the sweet soothing voice of my hostess, which spoke a kindness with which lately I had been little conversant. When my hunger was appeased, she drew my story from me, encouraged me to write to my father, and kept me at her abode till after a few days, I returned to school pardoned. No long time elapsed before I got into the upper forms, and my woeful slavery ended. Whenever I was able, I visited my disguised nymph. I no longer associated with my schoolfellows. Their diversions, their pursuits appeared vulgar and stupid to me. I had but one object in view, to accomplish my lessons, and to steal to the cottage of Ellen Burnett. Do not look grave, love. True, others as young as I then was have loved, and I might also, but not Ellen. Her profound, her intense melancholy sister to despair, her serious, sad discourse, her mind, estranged from all worldly concerns, forbade that. But there was an enchantment in her sorrow, a fascination in her converse that lifted me above commonplace existence. She created a magic circle which I entered as holy ground. It was not akin to heaven, for grief was the presiding spirit, but there was an exaltation of sentiment, an enthusiasm, a view beyond the grave, which made it unearthly, singular, wild, enthralling. You have often observed that I strangely differ from all other men. I mingle with them, make one in their occupations and diversions, but I have a portion of my being sacred from them. A living well, sealed up from their contamination, lies deep in my heart. It is of little use, but there it is. Ellen opened the spring, and it has flowed ever since. Of what did she talk? She recited no past adventures, alluded to no past intercourse with friend or relative. She spoke of the various woes that wait on humanity, on the intricate mazes of life, on the miseries of passion, of love, remorse, and death, and that which we may hope or fear beyond the tomb. She spoke of the sensation of wretchedness alive in her own broken heart, and then she grew fearfully eloquent, till suddenly pausing she reproached herself for making me familiar with such wordless misery. "I do you harm," she often said. "I unfit you for society. I have tried, seeing you thrown upon yonder distorted miniature of a bad world, to estrange you from its evil contagion. I fear that I shall be the cause of greater harm to you than could spring from association with your fellow creatures in the ordinary course of things. This is not well. Avoid the stricken deer." There were darker shades in the picture than those which I have already developed. Ellen was more miserable than the imagination of one like you, dear girl, unacquainted with woe, can portray. Sometimes she gave words to her despair. It was so great as to confuse the boundary between physical and mental sensation, and every pulsation of her heart was a throb of pain. She has suddenly broken off in talking of her sorrows, with a cry of agony, bidding me leave her, hiding her face on her arms, shivering with the anguish some thought awoke. The idea that chiefly haunted her, though she earnestly endeavoured to put it aside, was self-destruction, to snap the silver cord that bound together so much grace, wisdom, and sweetness, to rob the world of a creation made to be its ornament. Sometimes her piety checked her. Oftener a sense of unendurable suffering made her brood with pleasure over the dread resolve. She spoke of it to me as being wicked, yet I often fancied this was done rather to prevent her example from being of ill effect to me, than from any conviction that the Father of all would regard angrily the last act of his miserable child. Once she had prepared the mortal beverage. It was on the table before her when I entered. She did not deny its nature, she did not attempt to justify herself. She only besought me not to hate her, and to soothe by my kindness her last moments. "I cannot live," was all her explanation, all her excuse, and it was spoken with such fervent wretchedness that it seemed wrong to attempt to persuade her to prolong the sense of pain. I did not act like a boy, I wonder I did not. I made one simple request to which she instantly acceded, that she should walk with me to this belvedere. It was a glorious sunset. Beauty and the spirit of love breathed in the wind and hovered over the softened hues of the landscape. "Look, Ellen," I cried, "if only such loveliness of nature existed, it were worth living for." True, if a latent feeling did not blot this glorious scene with murky shadows, beauty is as we see it. My eyes view all things deformed and evil. She closed them as she said this, but, young and sensitive, the visitings of the soft breeze already began to minister consolation. "Dearest Ellen," I continued, "what do I not owe to you? I am your boy, your pupil. I might have gone on blindly as others do, but you opened my eyes. You have given me a sense of the just, the good, the beautiful, and have you done this merely for my misfortune? If you leave me, what can become of me?" The last words came from my heart, and tears gushed from my eyes. "Do not leave me, Ellen," I said. "I cannot live without you, and I cannot die, for I have a mother, a father." She turned quickly round, saying, "You are blessed sufficiently." Her voice struck me as unnatural. She grew deadly pale as she spoke, and was obliged to sit down. Still I clung to her, prayed, cried, till she, I had never seen her shed a tear before, burst into passionate weeping. After this she seemed to forget her resolve. We returned by moonlight, and our talk was even more calm and cheerful than usual. When in her cottage I poured away the fatal draught. Her good night bore with it no traces of her late agitation, and the next day she said, "I have thoughtlessly, even wickedly, created a new duty to myself, even at a time when I had forsworn all, but I will be true to it. Pardon me for making you familiar with emotions and scenes so dire. I will behave better. I will preserve myself if I can, till the link between us is loosened or broken, and I am free again." One little incident alone occurred during our intercourse that appeared at all to connect her with the world. Sometimes I brought her a newspaper, for those were stirring times, and though before I knew her she had forgotten all except the world her own heart enclosed, yet to please me, she would talk of Napoleon, Russia, from whence the emperor now returned overthrown, and the prospect of his final defeat. The paper lay one day on her table. Some words caught her eye. She bent eagerly down to read them, and her bosom heaved with violent palpitation, but she subdued herself, and after a few moments told me to take the paper away. Then indeed, I did feel an emotion of even impertinent inquisitiveness. I found nothing to satisfy it, though afterwards I became aware that it contained a singular advertisement, saying, "If these lines meet the eye of any one of the passengers who were on board the St. Mary, bound for Liverpool from Barbados, which sailed on the 3rd of May last and was destroyed by fire in the high seas, a part of the crew only having been saved by His Majesty's frigate the Bellerophon, they are entreated to communicate with the advertiser, and if anyone be acquainted with the particulars of the Hun, Miss Eversham's fate and present abode, they are earnestly requested to disclose them, directing to L.E. Stratton Street, Park Lane. It was after this event, as winter came on, that symptoms of decided ill health declared themselves in the delicate frame of my poor Ellen. I have often suspected that, without positively attempting her life, she did many things that tended to abridge it and to produce mortal disease. Now, when really ill, she refused all medical attendance, but she got better again, and I thought her nearly well when I saw her for the last time, before going home for the Christmas holidays. Her manner was full of affection. She relied, she said, on the continuation of my friendship. She made me promise never to forget her, though she refused to write to me and forbade any letters from me. Even now I see her standing at her humble doorway. If an appearance of illness and suffering can ever be termed lovely, it was in her. Still she was to be viewed as the wreck of beauty. What must she not have been in happier days, with her angel expression of face, her nymph-like figure, her voice whose tones were music. So young, so lost, was the sentiment that burst even from me, a young lad, as I waved my hand to her as a last adieu. She hardly looked more than 15, but none could doubt that her very soul was impressed by the sad lines of sorrow that rested so unceasingly on her fair brow. Away from her, her figure forever floated before my eyes. I put my hands before them, still she was there. My day, my night dreams were filled by my recollections of her. During the winter holidays, on a fine soft day, I went out to hunt. You, dear Juliet, will remember the sad catastrophe. I fell and broke my leg. The only person who saw me fall was a young man who rode one of the most beautiful horses I ever saw, and I believe it was by watching him as he took a leap that I incurred my disaster. He dismounted and was at my side in a minute. My own animal had fled. He called his, it obeyed his voice. With ease he lifted my light figure on to the saddle, contriving to support my leg, and so conducted me a short distance to a lodge situated in the woody recesses of Elmore Park, the seat of the Earl of 500, whose second son my preserver was. He was my sole nurse for a day or two, and during the whole of my illness passed many hours of each day by my bedside. As I lay gazing on him, while he read to me, or talked, narrating 1,000 stranger adventures which had occurred during his service in the peninsula, I thought, is it forever to be my fate to fall in with the highly gifted and excessively unhappy? The immediate neighbour of Lewis' family was Lord Evesham. He had married in very early youth and became a widower young. After this misfortune, which passed like a deadly blight over his prospects and possessions, leaving the gay view utterly sterile and bare, he left his surviving infant daughter under the care of Lewis' mother, and travelled for many years in far distant lands. He returned when Clarice was about 10, a lovely sweet child, the pride and delight of all connected with her. Lord Evesham, on his return, he was then hardly more than 30, devoted himself to her education. They were never separate. He was a good musician and she became a proficient under his tutoring. They rode, walked, read together. When a father is all that a father may be, the sentiments of filial piety, entire dependence and perfect confidence being united, the love of a daughter is one of the deepest and strongest, as it is the purest passion of which our natures are capable. Clarice worshipped her parent, who came, during the transition from mere childhood to the period when reflection and observation awaken, to adorn a commonplace existence with all the brilliant adjuncts which enlightened and devoted affection can bestow. He appeared to her like an especial gift of Providence, a guardian angel, but far dearer as being akin to her own nature. She grew under his eye in loveliness and refinement both of intellect and heart. These feelings were not divided, almost strengthened by the engagement that had taken place between her and Lewis. Lewis was destined for the army, and after a few years' service they were to be united. It is hard when all is fair and tranquil, when the world, opening before the ardent gaze of youth, looks like a well-kept domain, unencumbered by let or hindrance for the annoyance of the young traveller, that we should voluntarily stray into desert wilds and tempest-visited districts. Lewis Elmore was ordered to Spain, and at the same time Lord Evesham found it necessary to visit some estates he possessed in Barbados. He was not sorry to revisit a scene which had dwelt in his memory as an earthly paradise, nor to show to his daughter a new and strange world, so to form her understanding and enlarge her mind. They were to return in 3 months, and departed as on a summer tour. Clarice was glad that, while her lover gathered experience and knowledge in a distant land, she should not remain in idleness. She was glad that there would be some diversion for her anxiety during his perilous absence, and in every way she enjoyed the idea of travelling with her beloved father, who would fill every hour and adorn every new scene with pleasure and delight. They sailed. Clarice wrote home, with enthusiastic expressions of rapture and delight from Madeira. Yet without her father, she said, the fair scene had been blank to her. More than half her letter was filled by the expressions of her gratitude and affection for her adored and revered parent, while he in his, with fewer words perhaps, but with no less energy, spoke of his satisfaction in her improvement, his pride in her beauty, and his grateful sense of her love and kindness. Such were they, a matchless example of happiness in the dearest connection in life, as resulting from the exercise of their reciprocal duties and affections, a father and daughter, the one all care, gentleness, and sympathy, consecrating his life for her happiness, the other fond, duteous, grateful. Such had they been, and where were they now, the noble, kind, respected parent, and the beloved and loving child? They had departed from England as on a pleasure voyage down an inland stream, but the ruthless car of destiny had overtaken them on their unsuspecting way, crushing them under its heavy wheels, scattering love, hope, and joy as the bellowing avalanche overwhelms and grinds to mere spray the streamlet of the valley. They were gone, but whither? Mystery hung over the fate of the most helpless victim, and my friend's anxiety was to penetrate the clouds that hid poor Clarice from his sight. After an absence of a few months, they had written, fixing their departure in the St. Mary, to sail from Barbados in a few days. Lewis at the same time returned from Spain. He was invalided in his very first action by a bad wound in his side. He arrived and each day expected to hear of the landing of his friends, when that common messenger, the newspaper, brought him tidings to fill him with more than anxiety, with fear and agonizing doubt. The St. Mary had caught fire and had burned in the open sea. A frigate, the Bellerophon, had saved a part of the crew. In spite of illness and a physician's commands, Lewis set out the same day for London to ascertain as speedily as possible the fate of her he loved. There he heard that the frigate was expected in the Downs. Without alighting from his travelling chaise, he posted thither, arriving in a burning fever. He went on board, saw the commander, and spoke with the crew. They could give him few particulars as to whom they had saved. They had touched at Liverpool and left there most of the persons, including all the passengers rescued from the St. Mary. Physical suffering for a while disabled Mr. Elmore. He was confined by his wound and consequent fever, and only recovered to give himself up to his exertions to discover the fate of his friends. They did not appear nor write, and all Lewis' inquiries only tended to confirm his worst fears, yet still he hoped, and still continued indefatigable in his perquisitions. He visited Liverpool and Ireland, whither some of the passengers had gone, and learnt only scattered, incongruous details of the fearful tragedy, that told nothing of Miss Eversham's present abode, though much that confirmed his suspicion that she still lived. The fire on board the St. Mary had raged long and fearfully before the Bellerophon hove in sight, and boats came off for the rescue of the crew. The women were to be first embarked, but Clarice clung to her father, and refused to go till he should accompany her. Some fearful presentiment that, if she were saved, he would remain and die, gave such energy to her resolve, that not the entreaties of her father, nor the angry expostulations of the captain could shake it. Lewis saw this man, after the lapse of 2 or 3 months, and he threw most light on the dark scene. He well remembered that, transported with anger by her obstinacy, he had said to her, "You will cause your father's death, and be as much a parricide as if you put poison into his cup. You are not the first girl who has murdered her father in her wilful mood." Still Clarice passionately refused to go. There was no time for long parley. The point was yielded, and she remained pale but firm near her parent, whose arm was around her, supporting her during the awful interval. It was no period for regular action and calm order. A tempest was rising, the scorching waves blew this way and that, making a fearful day of the night which veiled all except the burning ship. The boats returned with difficulty, and one only could contrive to approach. It was nearly full. Lord Eversham and his daughter advanced to the deck's edge to get in. "We can only take one of you," vociferated the sailors. "Keep back on your life. Throw the girl to us, we will come back for you if we can." Lord Eversham cast with a strong arm his daughter, who had now entirely lost her self-possession, into the boat. She was alive again in a minute. She called to her father, held out her arms to him, and would have thrown herself into the sea, but was held back by the sailors. Meanwhile Lord Eversham, feeling that no boat could again approach the lost vessel, contrived to heave a spar overboard and threw himself into the sea, clinging to it. The boat, tossed by the huge waves, with difficulty made its way to the frigate. And as it rose from the trough of the sea, Clarice saw her father struggling with his fate, battling with the death that at last became the victor. The spar floated by, his arms had fallen from it. Were those his pallid features? She neither wept nor fainted, but her limbs grew rigid, her face colourless, and she was lifted as a log on to the deck of the frigate. The captain allowed that on her homeward voyage the people had rather a horror of her, as having caused her father's death. Her own servants had perished, few people remembered who she was, but they talked together with no careful voices as they passed her, and 100 times she must have heard herself accused of having destroyed her parent. She spoke to no one, or only in brief reply when addressed. To avoid the rough remonstrances of those around, she appeared at table, ate as well as she could. But there was a settled wretchedness in her face that never changed. When they landed at Liverpool, the captain conducted her to an hotel. He left her, meaning to return, but an opportunity of sailing that night for the Downs occurred, of which he availed himself without again visiting her. He knew, he said, and truly, that she was in her native country, where she had but to write a letter to gather crowds of friends about her. And where can greater civility be found than at an English hotel, if it is known that you are perfectly able to pay your bill? This was all that Mr. Elmore could learn, and it took many months to gather together these few particulars. He went to the hotel at Liverpool. It seemed that as soon as there appeared some hope of rescue from the frigate, Lord Evesham had given his pocket-book to his daughter's care, containing bills on a banking house at Liverpool to the amount of a few £100s. On the second day after Clarice's arrival there, she had sent for the master of the hotel and showed him these. He got the cash for her, and the next day she quitted Liverpool in a little coasting vessel. In vain Lewis endeavoured to trace her. Apparently she had crossed to Ireland, but whatever she had done, wherever she had gone, she had taken infinite pains to conceal herself, and all due was speedily lost. Lewis had not yet despaired. He was even now perpetually making journeys, sending emissaries, employing every possible means for her discovery. From the moment he told me this story, we talked of nothing else. I became deeply interested, and we ceaselessly discussed the probabilities of the case and where she might be concealed. That she did not meditate suicide was evident from her having possessed herself of money. Yet, unused to the world, young, lovely, and inexperienced, what could be her plan? What might not have been her fate? Meanwhile I continued for nearly 3 months confined by the fracture of my limb. Before the lapse of that time, I had begun to crawl about the ground, and now I considered myself as nearly recovered. It had been settled that I should not return to Eton but be entered at Oxford, and this leap from boyhood to man's estate elated me considerably. Yet still I thought of my poor Ellen, and was angry at her obstinate silence. Once or twice I had, disobeying her command, written to her, mentioning my accident, and the kind attentions of Mr. Elmore. Still she wrote not, and I began to fear that her illness might have had a fatal termination. She had made me vow so solemnly never to mention her name, never to inquire about her during my absence, that, considering obedience the first duty of a young inexperienced boy to one older than himself, I resisted each suggestion of my affection or my fears to transgress her orders. And now spring came, with its gift of opening buds, odoriferous flowers, and sunny genial days. I returned home, and found my family on the eve of their departure for London. My long confinement had weakened me. It was deemed inadvisable for me to encounter the bad air and fatigues of the metropolis, and I remained to rusticate. I rode and hunted and thought of Ellen, missing the excitement of her conversation, and feeling a vacancy in my heart which she had filled. I began to think of riding across the country from Shropshire to Berks for the purpose of seeing her. The whole landscape haunted my imagination, the fields round Eton, the silver Thames, the majestic forest, this lovely scene of Virginia water, the heath and her desolate cottage, she herself pale, slightly bending from weakness of health, awakening from dark abstraction to bestow on me a kind smile of welcome. It grew into a passionate desire of my heart to behold her, to cheer her as I might by my affectionate attentions, to hear her, and to hang upon her accents of inconsolable despair, as if it had been celestial harmony. As I meditated on these things, a voice seemed forever to repeat, "Now go, or it will be too late," while another yet more mournful tone responded, "You can never see her more." I was occupied by these thoughts, as on a summer moonlight night I loitered in the shrubbery, unable to quit a scene of entrancing beauty, when I was startled at hearing myself called by Mr. Elmore. He came on his way to the coast. He had received a letter from Ireland, which made him think that Miss Evesham was residing near Enniscorthy, a strange place for her to select, but as concealment was evidently her object, not an improbable one, yet his hopes were not high. On the contrary, he performed this journey more from the resolve to leave nothing undone than in expectation of a happy result. He asked me if I would accompany him. I was delighted with the offer, and we departed together on the following morning. We arrived at Milford Haven, where we were to take our passage. The packet was to sail early in the morning. We walked on the beach and beguiled the time by talk. I had never mentioned Ellen to Lewis. I felt now strongly inclined to break my vow and to relate my whole adventure with her, but restrained myself, and we spoke only of the unhappy Clarice, of the despair that must have been hers, of her remorse and unavailing regret. We retired to rest, and early in the morning I was called to prepare for going on board. I got ready and then knocked at Lewis' door. He admitted me, for he was dressed, though a few of his things were still unpacked and scattered about the room. The morocco case of a miniature was on his table. I took it up. "Did I never show you that?" said Elmore. "Poor dear Clarice, she was very happy when that was painted." I opened it. Rich, luxuriant curls clustered on her brow and the snow-white throat. There was a light zephyr appearance in the figure, an expression of unalloyed exuberant happiness in the countenance. But those large dove's eyes, the innocence that dwelt on her mouth, could not be mistaken, and the name of Ellen Burnett burst from my lips. There was no doubt. Why had I ever doubted? The thing was so plain. Who but the survivor of such a parent, and she the apparent cause of his death, could be so miserable as Ellen? A torrent of explanation followed, and 1,000-minute circumstances, forgotten before, now assured us that my sad hermitess was the beloved of Elmore. No more sea voyage, not a second of delay. Our chaise, the horses' heads tamed to the east, rolled on with lightning rapidity, yet far too slowly to satisfy our impatience. It was not until we arrived at Worcester that the tide of expectation, flowing all one way, ebbed. Suddenly, even while I was telling Elmore some anecdote to prove that, in spite of all, she would be accessible to consolation, I remembered her ill health and my fears. Lewis saw the change my countenance underwent. For some time I could not command my voice, and when at last I spoke, my gloomy anticipations passed like an electric shock into my friend's soul. When we arrived at Oxford, we halted for an hour or two, unable to proceed. Yet we did not converse on the subject so near our hearts, nor until we arrived in sight of Windsor did a word pass between us. Then Elmore said, "Tomorrow morning, dear Neville, you shall visit Clarice. We must not be too precipitate." The morrow came. I arose with that intolerable weight at my breast which it is grief's worst heritage to feel. A sunny day it was, yet the atmosphere looked black to me. My heart was dead within me. We sat at the breakfast table, but neither ate, and after some restless indecision we left our inn, and to protract the interval walked to Bishopsgate. Our conversation belied our feelings. We spoke as if we expected all to be well. We felt that there was no hope. We crossed the heath along the accustomed path. On one side was the luxuriant foliage of the forest, on the other the widespread moor. Her cottage was situated at one extremity, and could hardly be distinguished until we should arrive close to it. When we drew near, Lewis bade me go on alone. He would wait my return. I obeyed and reluctantly approached the confirmation of my fears. At length it stood before me, the lonely cot and desolate garden. The unfastened wicket swung in the breeze. Every shutter was closed. To stand motionless and gaze on these symbols of my worst forebodings was all that I could do. My heart seemed to me to call aloud for Ellen, for such was she to me. Her other name might be a fiction, but silent as her own life-deserted lips were mine. Lewis grew impatient and advanced. My stay had occasioned a transient ray of hope to enter his mind. It vanished when he saw me in her deserted dwelling. Slowly we turned away, and were directing our steps back again, when my name was called by a child. A little girl came running across some fields towards us, whom at last I recognized as having seen before with Ellen. "Mr. Neville, there is a letter for you," cried the child. "A letter? Where? Who?" "The lady left a letter for you. You must go to Old Windsor to Mr. Cook. He has got it for you." She had left a letter. Was she then departed on an earthly journey? "I will go for it immediately. Mr. Cook, Old Windsor, where shall I find him? Who is he?" "Oh, sir, everybody knows him," said the child. "He lives close to the churchyard. He is the sexton." After the burial, Nancy gave him the letter to take care of. Had we hoped, had we for a moment indulged the expectation of ever again seeing our miserable friend? Never, oh never. Our hearts had told us that the sufferer was at peace, the unhappy orphan with her father in the abode of spirits. Why then were we here? Why had a smile dwelt on our lips, now wreathed into the expression of anguish? Our full hearts demanded one consolation, to weep upon her grave, her sole link now with us, her mourners. There at last my boy's grief found vent in tears, in lamentation. You saw the spot. The grassy mound rests lightly on the bosom of fair Clarice, of my own poor Ellen. Stretched upon this, kissing the scarcely springing turf, for many hours no thought visited me but the wretched one, that she had lived, and was lost to me for ever. If Lewis had ever doubted the identity of my friend with her he loved, the letter put into our hands undeceived him. The handwriting was Miss Eversham's. It was directed to me, and contained words like these. I have vowed never to mention certain beloved names, never to communicate with beings who cherished me once, to whom my deepest gratitude is due, and as well as poor bankrupt can is paid. Perhaps it is a mere prevarication to write to you, dear Horace, concerning them, but heaven pardon me, my disrobed spirit would not repose, I fear, if I did not thus imperfectly bid them a last farewell. You know him, Neville, and know that he for ever laments her whom he has lost. Describe your poor Ellen to him, and he will speedily see that she died on the waves of the murderous Atlantic. Ellen had nothing in common with her, save love for and interest in him. Tell him it had been well for him, perhaps, to have united himself to the child of prosperity, the nursling of deep love, but it had been destruction, even could he have meditated such an act, to wed the parricide. I will not write that word. Sickness and near death have taken the sting from my despair. The agony of woe which you witnessed is melted into tender affliction and pious hope. I am not miserable now. Now. When you read these words, the hand that writes, the eye that sees, will be a little dust, becoming one with the earth around it. You, perhaps he will visit my quiet retreat, bestow a few tears on my fate, but let them be secret. They may make green my grave, but do not let a misplaced feeling adorn it with any other tribute. It is my last request. Let no stone, no name mark that spot. Farewell, dear Horace. Farewell to one other whom I may not name. May the God to whom I am about to resign my spirit in confidence and hope bless your earthly career. Blindly, perhaps, you will regret me for your own sakes, but for mine, you will be grateful to the Providence which has snapped the heavy chain binding me to unutterable sorrow, and which permits me from my lowly grass-grown tomb to say to you, I am at peace.